government managed and mismanaged the regional apparatus and the state apparatus in the Soviet period that really draws really beautifully on both political science theory and on really deeply researched history. It's really one of these nice marriage of the two disciplines. He takes full advantage of that. Today, we're going to be hearing about a different project, Authoritarian Rule of Law, the Soviet Case. And we have an audience online as well. So if you are online and you do have questions at any time, feel free to send them in, and we'll likely reserve them for the question and answer period. But for now, please join me in welcoming Yoram Gorlizki.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm giving this presentation as part of a stay at Columbia, and I'd like to begin by thanking the support staff at the Harriman Institute, if possible, but I'd like to extend a particular warm thanks to Tim for his kindness and generosity in hosting us and for chairing today's session. Okay, so the authoritarian rule of law. I want to begin with an observation, and it stems from the 1990s and early 2000s, after the fall of communism. It was widely assumed that democracy and the rule of law move in unison, and one automatically reinforces the other. So the notion that there's an organic link between democracy and the rule of law is something that has very deep historical roots, but it took on a particularly accentuated form in this period. So the rule of law is touted as part of a package that goes hand in hand with the creation of democracies and markets. Very often, democracy and the rule of law were mouthed in the same phrase, and the assumption was that they were actually part of the same thing. So there was a sort of conceptual sludge, if you like. There's kind of laziness about the use of these terms and what they actually meant. So this had both a policy and a scholarly dimension. In terms of policy, the 10 commandments, if you like, the Washington Consensus, included building democracy and establishing the rule of law. It entered into the criteria that were applied by the World Bank and by the European Union for extending aid, but also for their enlargement criteria in the case of the EU. So you had to aspire to the rule of law, and you had to cross various thresholds for the acquis communautaire in order to qualify as a candidate member for joining the EU. There was also a scholarly dimension. So you look at political theorists, people like Judith Sklar and Jean Hampton argued that you could only have a proper rule of law if there was a vigorous representative democracy. And the two were absolutely intertwined. Among empirical political scientists, probably the best example is Barry Weinbust's article from 1997, which argued in effect that democracy and the rule of law have a common stem, a common root. And the implication was that you couldn't have one without the other. Okay, what I want to do is to look at a little-known campaign and see what light it can shed on broader questions. And especially on this relationship between regime type and the rule of law. And you'll already understand that I'm departing quite clearly from a standard social scientific methodology. In political science, you start with a question and then you develop the methodology. Here, I'm starting off with a particular case study and trying to work out what kind of light it can shed on broader questions. What are the broader questions that are of interest? Is there such a thing as an authoritarian rule of law? There's a literature over the last few years which is devoted specifically to this question. What is the role of constitutions and dictatorships? How does the rule of law come about? Now, this is a work that draws on interdisciplinary scholarship. So scholarship from political science, from history, and from law. And there will be moments in today's presentation, if you come from one of these disciplines where you think that perhaps you're attending the wrong session. And I want to kind of reassure you, because what I'm trying to do is to appeal to scholars from each of these disciplines, because I start off with a very specific campaign from a very specific historical context. There's going to be quite a lot of historical detail in part two. But hang on in there if you're not a historian, because there will be bits later on which I think may address questions that are of interest. Okay, so one other thing I should say is that I gave this paper on Tuesday at Yale, and I slightly overran, but I want to try and I'm going to try and keep it 50 minutes. So there are bits that I'm just going to skim over, so that there's enough time for.
We're a much more knowledgeable audience, so you
right. Okay.
right through, I'm
sure. Yes. So the Soviet Union is a very, very oppressive state, and emblematic of very high levels of coercion as the network of camps, colonies, special settlements, and prisons that make up the Gulag. But even in the context of Stalinist USSR, the second half of 1948, early 1949, it's a particularly grim period. In April, you see the start of the biggest deportations from the Baltic republics as they were then. Against any notion of the rule of law. You have individuals who served their terms, and then they are rearrested, charged, and sent into exile. That breaks basically every convention of the rule of law. And of course, Stalin, he murders members of the Politburo, most notably like Vosnesensky. So, amidst all of this, in the spring of 1948, the regime launches a very odd campaign against unfounded prosecutions. And this is a campaign with a difference. There are actually two major differences, because unlike other justice campaigns, which are basically staged for show and propaganda, this campaign touches on the very core of the criminal justice system, and it affects working practices, and it does so for many years. And secondly, unlike the normal rhythm of Soviet campaigns, where you have a flurry, a burst of activity, which is followed by a period of disengagement and neglect, the regime holds steadfast to this campaign. And it outlasts Stalin and outlasts Khrushchev as well. And it actually kind of works its way into the fabric of the Soviet justice system. So it's actually quite an important campaign. One of the arguments I make is that underlying the campaign is a set of ideas about the rule of law and the socialist state. Now, those of you who are political scientists will know that there's a lot of research on the role of ideas in policy making in established democracies. The idea is that policies of contemporary democracies are mediated and sustained by ideas. For it is these ideas that help to cohere politicians and bureaucrats and stable coalitions. There's a very famous article by Peter Hall, it's actually published in 1992, there's also a book, which I'll come back to a little bit later on in the presentation. The Soviet Union in the late 1940s was not an established democracy. And at the same time, my argument is that ideas, even in a regime that is highly ideological, play a very important role in bringing together officials and even bureaucrats and even politicians. So the campaign against unfounded prosecutions is rooted in a set of ideas, which is championed by a group of lawyers. Now, these ideas are grounded in provisions of the Soviet Constitution of 1936, and I'll draw your attention in particular to the last of these, protecting the viability of the person. These actually become very, very important in the late 1940s, surprisingly so. Okay, so the rule of law is a term that there are hundreds of articles about it. Apart from anything else, over the last 4 years, there are two compendiums, handbooks on the rule of law. There's one as Cambridge Handbook, edited by Martin Laughlin and Jens Meyer-Henrich, 700 pages. And then November 2024, there's the Sage Handbook on the rule of law. There's an enormous literature there, and what I want to do is just to distill two core elements from this literature, and I'll be returning to this at the very end of the paper. The first is an emphasis on what's known as formal legality, and the important point to emphasize here is that actually it's not on courts, but the emphasis on the main literature on this is actually on legislation, on the nature of legislation. It has to be prospective, clear, and stable. And I'll come back to this at the very, very end of the paper. But there is also a subsidiary interest in due process court proceedings, legal hearings, open, accessible, defendants who are afforded certain protections as set out in published statutes or codes. The other element is that you need to have government limited by law. And there are a number of different dimensions to this, but the one that is most important to me is that there needs to be some law-based mechanism for constraining the sovereign. Now, Stalin was arguably the least constrained sovereign of any leader of any authoritarian state in the 20th century. At the same time, if we widen our optics and if we lengthen our time horizons, and we look not so much at an individual, but at the office, if you like, of the leader, what we do see is that the state over which Stalin presides is indeed constrained by law. And the important argument here is that it's constrained not by bureaucracy, but specifically by law. That's actually very important. Okay, so this is the, for those of you who aren't historians, this is going to be probably the most boring bit, but I do need to say something about it. It was actually a very, very important piece of historical context. So outside periods of all-out war, the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the early 1930s, experienced probably the most radical breakdown of law and order in any state in the 20th century. And one of the reasons for this is that the state, from the state's perspective, it actually was engaged in war with class enemies, which it believed were intent on derailing the state from its revolutionary course. And against these enemies, and in particular those which the state stigmatized as kulaks, which supposedly were opposed to the state's signature policy of collectivization, there was absolutely no room for legal niceties. And there are two dimensions to this. First of all, you have the troika, which were established in the early 1930s, and relatively large numbers of people are executed. But what has received most attention are the deportations, special settlements. So you get peasants who have all their belongings confiscated. They're deported from their farmsteads and from homesteads and farms, and deposited in special settlements in Siberia and North Kazakhstan. where many perish from the cold, from illness and malnutrition. So this is about as far away as you can get from the rule of law. And in fact, there's actually no legality. There are no rights that are accorded to these individuals. The 1930s was so bad that it was actually not one ground zero, but there were two. There were two historical lows in terms of in terms of the rights that are accorded to Soviet citizens. The second phase, the mass operations in 1937 to 1938, there are two factors which militate against any notion of legality. The first is just the sheer brutality. Almost 700,000 people are executed, very often after humiliating interrogations and excruciating tortures. And I think it's important to emphasize here that of all the people who are executed across Stalin's rule, around, depending the arguments about the numbers, but around 65 to 85% are murdered, are executed directly in a period of 15 months from basically August 1937 to October 1938. And then there are almost 1 million people who are sent to the camps. There's a strong thread that unites these two phases. So it's both a process through administrative procedures that lie outside the justice system, but the regime also exercises what, in fact, a scholar, I think it was at Columbia, from the early 1950s, referred to as prophylactic arrests, which are aimed at detaining not people who've committed crimes, but those, because of their social profile, are viewed as objectively hostile to the regime and most likely to act against it at some point in the future. So one of the things, and I'll come back to this again in a moment, that the regime does in the 1920s is it jettisons juridical categories of crime, punishment, and personal fault, and it replaces them with the notion of social danger. So it doesn't matter actually what you do, but if you belong to a socially dangerous group, in fact, you don't even need to belong to a socially dangerous group, but if you have associated with people who came from a socially dangerous group, you can be arrested. And that's actually how both of these waves of repression were legitimized. Okay, I'm going to skip over the first part of this because we don't have time, but I'm just going to say a little bit about there's a specific resolution on procedures for arrests of 17th of June 1935, which is often overlooked. And it's actually a very important resolution because what it does is it points to a gear shift in the Soviet regime. The regime is interested now not just simply in eliminating the opposition, but in building a new class structure, having socialist property, having a new constitution, building a new elite. This goes back to a famous article by Sheila Fitzpatrick in the late 1970s. And what he wants to do is to show these people, members of the new elite, they're going to get some protections. So this resolution is aimed at engineers, agronomists, doctors, heads of educational institutions, heads of enterprises, but above all, party officials. Now, the interesting thing is that the resolution is completely forgotten about when the mass operations start. But it's reintroduced very, very quickly afterwards. And the question that I'm interested in is why is it binding now in a way that, that it hadn't been, certainly in the previous 2 years? What makes certain resolutions bind? Why are they binding in a way that others aren't? Okay, in order to answer this question, again, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. There's a very important moment in March 1939 when both Stalin and Zhdanov announced that there will no longer be mass purges. Zhdanov talks about unfounded expulsions, необоснованные исключения from the party. And he says expulsions from the party will be brought to a minimum. And in fact, they're going to be replaced by a sliding scale of lesser penalties, cautions, censures, rebukes, reprimands, severe reprimands. So there's a dramatic fall in the volume of expulsions from the party, and this is reflected in the following graph. And you will see that the real turning point is 1939. Up until that, you have enormous volatility in levels of expulsions from the party. But something happens, something quite radical happens in 1939, and it's to do with Zhdanov's announcement. And the idea is that there's no longer going to be mass expulsions. The expulsions from now on are going to be carried out on an individual basis. Okay, so this, Tim mentioned a book that Alek Khriluk and I brought out a few years ago, Substate Dictatorship. One of the arguments that we make in that book, and it draws on an insight from Ronald Wintrow, whose book on political economy of dictatorship, is that in one-party regimes, membership of the party is not a voluntary act, but it's a privilege. And this is actually becomes very important, and it's one of the things that differentiates Leninist one-party regimes from other types of dictatorship. The party doesn't control assets and it doesn't control repression, but what it does do is it controls the terms of exclusion. And this becomes absolutely vital to understanding party rule, basically from the whole period, from 1939 onwards, and to a degree even before that. Why the sudden drop? I'm not going to go into the first point in any detail. There is a change in the ideology. You now have only three classes. There's the peasantry, the working class, and the Soviet intelligentsia. The important point is that even though you've eliminated all the capitalists and the speculators and the merchants and the kulaks, because there's no longer exploitation, these classes are themselves fundamentally different to how they were before. So the environment is very different. There's something else which is really very important. It's not very much to be written about it. There's a surge in appeals by party members during the mass operations. And they really filled up even at the end of 1937. And this is important because remember that the regime is trying to create.
These are appeals to join or appeals about being
expelled from the party.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It's an important question. From 1934 to 1936, there was a moratorium on joining the party because there was an exchange of party documents at the time. At the beginning of 1938, there's a massive influx, and this is something that people I think have lost sight of. In a massive influx into the party, hundreds of thousands. This is at the same time as you have the mass operations, and the party is very, very nervous about this because this is their new elite, this is their constituency, and their constituents are complaining in very, very large numbers. And in fact, we now know that in January 1938 there was a majority within the party leadership that actually wanted to bring an end to the purges, and it was only Stalin who actually overruled that. He insisted that it should carry on, and that was actually a very momentous decision. It cost many hundreds of thousands of lives. Okay, again, I'm going to try and I'm going to get through the first bit, but if anyone that wants to ask me questions about it, I'll be very happy to address them. Technically, party purges and mass repressions are completely separate things, and there was a time many, many years ago when Arch Getty put out a book arguing that the two only coalesced in February 1937. We know now that is really just simply wrong. That in 1936, 1935, if you were expelled from the party on the grounds you're an enemy of the people, or for all sorts of other reasons, chances were very high that you would also be arrested. Now, the main argument I want to make here is that for the party leadership, the emphasis now is on protecting party cadres and offering them protections. And so that explains the move from mass purges to an individual approach. The jurists, however, want to extend these protections to everyone, not just party members, but to the whole population. Now, this is a much, much harder task. And it's a harder task because they can't appeal to the ideological template in the way that that the party leadership can in relation to party members. But it's also a harder, much harder task because it's not driven by these mass appeals from within the party. Of course, there are lots of appeals coming from ordinary citizens about being unfairly arrested and incarcerated, but the party doesn't really care very much about that. So the jurists have a much harder task. Okay, I now move on to the second part of the paper, and I'm completely switching gear. So this is the bit where I fear that some historians are going to feel uncomfortable and sort of possibly not in that kind of comfort zone. But again, try and bear with me a little bit. Okay, so scholarship on policy making in Western democracies, how do interests map onto policies? Very often the idea is that there are unstated assumptions about the ideas that agents have about what is they're maximizing, ideas about how the world works, and ideas they have about tools they have to further their interests. And there's a sort of recognition that human behavior is driven by abstract ideals, by sacred values, and by notions of loyalty that cannot be reduced to economic interests. So this has been applied to all kinds of policy areas. Like Keynesianism, which we'll come back to in a moment, civil rights legislation in the US, EU, European Monetary Union. There are lots of other areas as well, and I'm not going to go into all of that, but I will just very briefly say a couple of things about this really important article, seminal article by Peter Hall, very widely cited, who distinguishes between ordinary policies and what he calls radical change in the overarching terms of policy discourse. There are specific reasons for this in the 1970s. The most important of which is that you have a development that traditional Keynesianism cannot explain. Why is it that there are rising levels of inflation and stagnating levels of growth and employment? What happens in the course of the 1970s, and it takes a different form in Britain and the United States. Mark Blythe wrote an interesting book on how it unfolded in the US. Is Keynesianism begins to lose coherence in the eyes of politicians, officials, and the public. And an intense debate emerges. And this debate spills beyond the borders of the state to take in the media, financial markets, and what Peter Hall calls a growing marketplace of ideas, so that policy change becomes a society-wide affair. There are very specific things that happen there, which I'm happy to talk about, but it's probably less relevant for this paper. Okay, so in the 1930s, there is a big debate among lawyers, among jurists, a very famous debate that was written about quite a lot in the 50s and 60s. I'm going to oversimplify and not do justice to the complexity of this debate, but there are basically two sides, and I'm not going to go as it were into the details, but they're all set out in this slide. The important point is that the standoff between the two sides of this debate is broken when the autocrat stands up December 1936 and says, he just utters a single sentence. We now need stability of the laws more than ever. That's the only thing that he says. 6 weeks later, one of his hacks writes an article in Pravda, and within 18 months, this lot at the top are executed. So this is not a marketplace of ideas. It couldn't be anything further from a marketplace of ideas. You just have this, the ruler, the dictator at the top. He utters a sentence, and then And then everything in a sense is follows on from that. So what at the same time, and I suppose what you have are a group of jurists who occupy an area that is less known to the dictator and less understood by the dictator. And what they do is they begin to carve out a discourse and a set of ideas. And there are four ideas specifically. And again, I'm going to be I'm going to move through these quite quickly. The first is to do with the validity and integrity of law, and I think it's summarized, I think, very well by Wyszynski's following statement: the reduction of law to politics would signify the ignoring of those tasks standing before law, such as the tasks of legal protection of personal property, family, testamentary, and other rights and interests. So originally, there had been this idea, this kind of Marxian idea, that law would wither away along with the state. But actually, if you look at Soviet justice policy, that is never taken seriously. I mean, from the very beginning, no one really takes that seriously. But there are attempts, in order to justify greater flexibility in law, in effect, to reduce law to economics or law to politics. And what Wyszynski is saying is that law had its own independent basis of existence. And it's at this time, as they're trying to justify the shift from mass purges, mass operations, to individual prosecutions, that there's a return of these classical juridical categories of crimes, punishment, and guilt, instead of the sociological categories of socially dangerous acts and measures of social defense. And that happens exactly in the late 1936, 1937, 1938. Okay, so now that there's a second aspect of this, and this is the role of the individual. Remember that the jurists are not talking about expulsions from the party, but they're talking about according individuals legal rights. Now, that, they say, is a much harder task. John Hazard, who was based, of course, at Columbia for many years, had a number of interesting articles in the late 1930s, where he says that running like a thread through all present Soviet criminal procedure is a solicitude for the individual. Soviet teachers emphasize that a strong, healthy state can only exist when the conviction of the innocent does not occur. And you might think, well, what the hell is going on here? You know, this is just at the same time as the mass operations, but they're taking this very seriously. And what they want to do is to switch from the expulsion of individual party members to the protection of individual citizens right across the whole population. Again, this is a slightly more technical area, but this is a coin with two sides. And what you have in the late 1930s is an upsurge in articles about personal guilt as the basis of criminal responsibility, as opposed to membership or a particular sociological category. So that all these articles about Vina and Vinovnost, you're thinking, well, what is going on? Why are they writing about this? But it's all about this particular effort to try and extend the terms of the switch from mass to individual prosecutions. Okay, so again, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly, and much of this stems from an article which I published in the Economic History Review in 2016, Theft Under Stalin, a Property Rights Analysis. Jurists are completely unable to write about the troika, about the extrajudicial tribunals. What they can do is to write about the benefits of the open courts. And in this regard, they get a helping hand from an unexpected quarter from Stalin himself. And in many of these areas, Stalin, he was clearly unhinged, but he was also very pragmatic, and he had some idea of the effects of his policies. And what Stalin is saying is that if we want to build a new society, if we want a new class structure, if we want a new elite, if we want a much larger Communist Party membership, if we want a new form of property, we can't do that in the murky, closed tribunals of the GPU. It has to be done in open courts. And actually, interestingly, Stalin refers to 18th century England, and he sees that the courts do exactly the same thing in the 18th century. But of course, in England, what they're doing is to create the notion of private property. What Stalin wants to do is to establish, to embed the notion of socialist property, which is a completely new type of property, and it's absolutely fundamental to him. And it's so fundamental to him that there's a complete switch in the repressive pattern of the state, and it moves away from eliminating oppositionists to arresting thieves. And the thieves are the people who are stealing this new category, socialist property. And in fact, we can even turn this round, and we see that through these campaigns, Stalin is actually creating in everyday life the concept of socialist property. What does the arrest of one carefree thief signify? There are hundreds of thousands of them. You cannot get rid of them with the help of the secret police. Another measure, more important and effective one, is needed. And this is reflected in the following graph, which comes from that article. What you see, if we're looking at the absolute priority of the Stalinist state, in the 1930s, all of these executions are for political crimes. But then that falls off in 1939. And by far the most important crime in the late Stalin era is theft of socialist property. And Stalin, in a sense, wants to use this campaign to create a new concept, a new idea of socialist property. By the time of his death, half of the Gulag are serving terms under the property laws. So this is something which is very interesting, because the lawyers are writing about this, and they're talking about, actually, yeah, we do need open courts, and there are all sorts of benefits when it comes to educating the wider population. Okay, the fourth idea. I'm gonna have to kind of go through this quite quickly, but the jurists realize that there's no point in getting overly exercised about the substance of criminal law, because Stalin will always, at any moment, he'll get up on the wrong side of the bed, and you'll say, oh, well, we need to kind of, we need to execute these people, or we need to arrest those people. What they focus on instead is this procedure. And what they're very interested in doing is ensuring that certain fundamental rights are protected through criminal procedures, the right to counsel, presence of the defendant at trial, and so on. And here they get a real helping hand from the 1936 Constitution. And what's interesting here is that when cases are overturned, you have acquittals in courts, very often they're on grounds that are directly connected to the 1936 Constitution. Okay, so what we find, the Soviet system has no tradition of separation of powers, and in fact, the exact opposite. Because lawyers are relatively low, occupy a low status within the system, they're actually inviting more intervention and more involvement from the party. And the greater the involvement of the party, the higher the status of what they do. But what we find is that within the justice system, they are, in a sense, internalizing a separation of powers. And judges begin to act as agents of preliminary control over the well-foundedness of cases. And we have evidence of this because there are really quite a large number of cases that are rejected by the judges. Either they're sent for supplementary investigations, or they end up in acquittals, or sometimes they're stopped. And they even set up a new moment in the criminal new moment of criminal procedure the pre-trial hearing as a means of exercise, kind of acting as gatekeepers, if you like, for the criminal justice process. With greater emphasis on these key pressure points, there's a shift from unfounded arrests and unfounded exclusions to unfounded prosecutions. And in fact, that's where my book actually starts in the late 1940s and the campaign for unfounded executions. Okay, so this is probably one of the most famous images in the history of politics. So it's Ambrogio Lorenzetti's allegory of good government, Siena, the first half of the 14th century. If you look at the textbooks and the encyclopedias of political science, this image just comes up again and again and again. Now, one thing that you can't really see so well with this level of resolution, but it is kind of important for my argument, is that there are two ropes. They're known as concords or concordias that descend. This figure on the left, you can see the two scales there. In fact, I'll probably have this. Yeah, there we go. So you can see the two scales. That's justice. And you have the rope which descends, thank you, from the left hand of justice. It passes through the representatives of the people, 24 consuls, and then it rises up here, and it's wrapped around the wrist of this stately bearded figure on the right here, who's supposed to represent the commune of Siena. So in effect, he is the ruler. And the idea is that both justice and the people constrain the ruler. But the thing that for me is more interesting is that the justice and the people are themselves bound together. And that leads into this idea that the rule of law and democracy are somehow fundamentally intertwined. So law in 14th century Siena means something completely different from what it means in 18th, 19th, 20th century Europe. There's no sense of law, of positive law, as acts that are passed by legislatures. Rather, it's a mixture of divine justice, divine law, divine justice, and natural law. And of course, this is a long way removed from institutions of democracy that we would understand. But there is a lineage that comes out of this and eventually turns into democracy and the rule of law. Now, I want to just end the paper with the last section. Basically argues there are very good reasons for disentangling institutions of law and self-government. And there are benefits in proposing narrower, more focused, analytically precise definitions of democracy and the rule of law. There are two reasons for this. I think one is that in the Cold War, you have people really unthinkingly, kind of almost unwittingly, repeating these terms about the rule of law and democracy without really knowing what they mean, and they become part of a sort of this kind of intellectual sludge, if you like. And it's time, I think, that there's a moment when the rule of law is understood in such highly expansive and ambiguous terms, which overlap so strongly with democracy that the one is often hard to distinguish from the other. The other is, and this brings us more to theories of democracy, the same logic which informs minimalist conceptions of democracy. You define democracy just in terms of one dimension. How is the ruler removed from office? And you leave out, responsiveness, accountability, political freedom, participation, and so on, because that enables you to explore causal connections much more easily. And you can do the same with the rule of law. That's one of the things that I try to do here, and I draw on the work of Joseph Raz, who taught at Oxford, but also at Columbia Law School for a while. And there's a very interesting, uncanny symmetry with the minimalist conception of democracy. The minimalist conception of democracy, people like Jaworski, Jennifer Gandhi, the famous article 2010 on categorizing regimes, where they explore this. Now, what Raz does is to come up with one simple sentence, and it's beguilingly simple, but it actually is very, very important to his understanding of what the rule of law is. If the law is to be obeyed, which is rather than conform to, it must be capable of guiding the behavior of its subjects. So there's again a very famous article by Joseph Raz in 1979, where he comes out with a number of quite polemical statements and engages, I think, in hyperbole. I think he probably goes a little bit too far. But the general argument is this. The rule of law says nothing about how law is to be made by tyrants, democratic majorities, or any other way. A non-democratic legal system may conform to the rule of law better than any of the legal systems of the more enlightened Western democracies. I don't think that's right, actually. I think that there is some kind of connection between the two, which he doesn't recognize. But what happens is, and this is one of the reasons why this approach is kind of interesting, it's very different for those of you who are lawyers or who are familiar with the literature on law from some of the other categorizations, like Lon Fuller's categorization of the rule of law, where he basically provides a shopping list of the different attributes of law. In fact, for him, it's law rather than the rule of law. But they're not necessarily directly connected one to the other. But with Raz, it all stems from that one insight, one fundamental insight. So all the laws should be prospective, open, and clear. They need to be these things because one can't be guided by a retroactive or a poorly framed law. They need to be stable because if the laws change, how will the people be guided by them? And it's in this context that the actual operation of the courts becomes significant. Independence of the judiciary needs to be guaranteed, and the principles of natural justice, open, fair hearing, and so on, need to be observed. It is futile to guide one's actions on the basis of the law if, when the matter comes to adjudication, the courts will not apply the law and will act for some reason. So there's no point in passing this law, and everyone is aware of it. But when it's applied completely differently because there's no judicial independence, for example, and there's bias and so on. Okay, so just very briefly, on the surface, the late 1940s of the Soviet Union doesn't seem to comply with any of this. The late 1940s is a high watermark for secrecy. There's a great book by Mark Harrison, which came out last year about Stalin's secret Leviathan, which shows actually this is the very, very worst moment for secrecy. So bad that it actually becomes completely counterproductive. Much legislation is retrospective, and Stalin's occasional interventions make law highly unstable. I'm actually going to miss this because there isn't an argument here, but it'll take us, and it's just going to take up too much time, and I'm running out of time anyway. So why apply the rule of law? Senior justice officials begin with the areas they can control. They sweep their side of the street. Especially when it comes to instilling the principles of natural justice in the ordinary court system. What they're trying to do is to extend the notion of unfounded exclusions to unfounded prosecutions, and these apply to all Soviet citizens. Now, after Stalin dies, they apply the same principles to legislation, and that's where Raz's categories become relevant: to openness, stability, and prospective character of legislation, and the independence of the courts, delegitimization of extrajudicial tribunals. Now, Raz is a political philosopher, and what he's primarily interested in is theoretical consistency. I'm interested in the empirical side of things and in change over time. And for that reason, my approach requires a more historical, sociological understanding of the rule of law. And that's why we bring in very briefly this second aspect. And again, this is a tradition that runs back to the early modern period. Essential to the rule of law is some notion of limited government. Um, Now, as I mentioned earlier on, Stalin at least constrained authoritarian leader in the 20th century. There is one difference, that the constraints here are not deliberate. Um, they're unintended, but they are constraints all the same. So constraining the leader is not the goal, but it is the effect. And the book ends with a campaign in the early 1960s, an anti-crime campaign, and the leaders are just astonished that the justice agencies are not doing what they want them to do. They're not kind of engaging in an all-out campaign. And justice agencies come back to them and they say, well, we can't do it because you introduced these rules. All these rules were introduced 15 years ago. And it's these rules which are preventing us from doing the kinds of things that you want us to do. And these rules are not to do with bureaucracy, but they are actually to do with law. Okay, so this is just sort of in terms of the evidence. This actually refers to acquittals, but you see that there's a massive decline in the number of acquittals after the campaign, which reaches its high point in 1948, 1949. They call it acquittals, but actually these are unfounded prosecutions. That's how the regime understands. That's the original goal of the campaign. And this dynamic, this trajectory, has the effect of binding the rulers. Okay, rule of law is benchmark, which allows us to compare, despite our efforts to pare down the concept. It consists of these two irreducible elements. There is some literature about a third element, which goes back to the Aristotelian notion of rule of law rather than rule of persons. But I think that is actually, there is a literature which argues that that's much more difficult to apply empirically for all sorts of reasons. Again, I'm very happy to go into that in the Q&A. We can't understand the kind of legal system Soviet jurists were trying to build, nor the consequences of their policies, unless we understand they were trying to create their own type of the rule of law. This process starts incrementally, but it builds up over time, especially after Stalin dies. And I'm going to stop here, but there is an argument as to why this is the rule of law rather than rule by law. And what I do, and again, I'm very happy to talk about this in the Q&A. This goes back to Achimoglu and Robinson's book from 2019, their discussion of the Gilgamesh problem. And what I try to argue is that they're fundamentally wrong in terms of how to conceiving the state in the way they do. And I think that that my case study is quite a good example, exemplifying why they're wrong. Okay, that's it. Thank you. Great, thank you.
Allow me to abuse my privilege as a moderator of lots and lots of questions. But let me just start with one about ideas and where they come from and how the justices were able to express them, and were these done primarily out of self-preservation goal, or were they driven by policy concerns? Where did they get their ideas from? It's not exactly the most open and tolerant period in Soviet history. So kind of, I ask because this is one of the common critiques of arguments about ideas, is that, if you peel them away long enough, they're reducible to something else. And, Hall does a nice job of showing that that's not the case. He kind of does a great job of showing all the ways that ideas are not reducible. So what's going on here in your story?
Thanks. Okay. There are a number of different sort of aspects to this. The first is that in the 1930s, there's an attack on jurists who were trained and educated in the sort of the Tsarist era. But they resurfaced in 1937, 1938. And in particular, in this one institution I'm interested in, the All Union Institute of Juridical Sciences. And these people are trained in Berlin and Paris, and they're very familiar with the classical principles of law and
So how do they come back like at that moment? Why? I mean, this seems
it's a very interesting. I mean, this could take us into a different area, but it's a very
it's important because sorry to cut you, but this is how do people with ideas get to be in the position so that their ideas matter? That's always an important part of the story. So sorry.
So one of the best examples is Gernet, who's regarded as the kind of founder of social criminology, and he is. It looks at one moment as if he might be repressed, but he's reduced. He's kind of almost blind. He's reduced to the status of a librarian, having been a really big, leading figure in the 1920s. What we know is that Wyszynski has a very, very high regard for Gernet, and we also know that Wyszynski he flew back from New York to attend Gernet's funeral. So in terms of piecing together the exact story, it's very clear that Wyszynski plays a role, but there are a whole bunch of other people. There's a guy called Paliansky, who was also very famous from being trained in the 1910s. The guy called Isaev, who again was in his 60s and 70s in this period. And so then all of a sudden, these people who'd been lampooned and attacked just a few years earlier, that they're given a position of prominence, and all of a sudden they're Festschrifts for them and so on. In terms, there are two other aspects to your question. In the late 1940s, the justice institutions, the institutions for researching justice, come under intense pressure. And we have kind of documents about that. And the Central Committee looks into removing various individuals. And what happens is that there are three lines to the attack. The first is there isn't enough reference to Stalin in their works. The second is that the work is too abstruse, so it's too complicated, and it doesn't really appeal to ordinary people. And the third aspect is it doesn't explain how the Soviet justice system is superior to the Western justice system. And so these people they're scratching their heads and they think, we've got a solution to this. We're going to go back to the Stalin constitution. So the Stalin constitution is Stalin's constitution. So you can't blame us for saying it's got nothing to do with Stalin. The statements could not be simpler. It's just like in individual sentences. This person has the right to do this, so on. And it is absolutely superior. I mean, the point of this constitution is to show that the system is superior. So they have an ally. They have a way of repackaging their ideas, and they're thinking, this is the way to do it. And then in 1950, you have these two kind of landmark Supreme Court resolutions, which are hugely influential, and you really wouldn't think, high watermark of Stalinism, that you would get resolutions in June and December 1950. The second one is only overturned, if you can imagine, in 1997. It is so significant. And they're rooted in their understanding of the Constitution. They find a mechanism for protecting themselves. But I think you point to a very important kind of intuition, really, and that is to do with the origins of ideas. And
it's a hard question.
I mean that's and it's to do with a level of motivation. What I don't want to do is to try and ascribe motivations that I have no confidence in. So that I can't answer.
Great.
So much, Yoram. My name is Yasker Magadov. I'm sorry. My question, and I know this is very unfashionable, and you're not really allowed to ask this question in Soviet history, but I really couldn't help but have this idea cross my mind during our talk. Was similar to Tim's. I'm wondering, like, do you see a sort of liberal impulse guiding the actions of these jurists, these people who are, although they are of course working with and very eager to curry favor with a very illiberal system and a liberal ruler, Stalin, I just can't help but feel like there's this sort of like desire to instill still Soviet, but somewhat has these small scale liberal values through this kind of like seemingly bizarre focus on proceduralism, which I am entirely convinced was like very front and center in the minds of these people. This period, certainly in the post-Stalin period. How do you deal with this question? Or is it just completely, like I said, it's like we're not really allowed to ask the question of like, was there a liberal opposition? It's really not opposition, but like, is there these sort of like flashpoints of liberal thinking? Or how do you see it?
Yeah, no, they're absolutely not liberals. I mean, I would love to say they are, but
maybe like accidentally like harboring liberal concept. Or is that just
yeah, no, yeah, I think we need to be kind of, in a sense, some hard-nosed about this. And if you read one of the most important figures in my story, is Konstantin Garshenin, who was a popular general and then becomes the Minister of Justice in 1948, and I was lucky enough to interview not him, but he said that would have been I'd be even older than I am. No, but to interview his assistant, who worked very, very closely with him for 2 years, from 1948 to 1949, and they would meet every day at 4 o'clock in the morning. Because Stalin went to sleep late, so everyone else had to go to sleep late. And this poor guy, he had a child, and you could only go home at 4 o'clock, and then he had to be back in the office at 10. He said it was just a nightmare. Whereas his Garshenin, the minister, had a flat near the Kremlin. What he did say, it was a very strange thing, but this assistant to Karshenin ended up living in the same building as I was in as quite a curious story, but I ended up interviewing him quite a lot. It is that Garshenin was clearly, he was moved, he had a sense, almost like a religious sense of compassion, because one of the things that they would discuss were the appeals that would come through, and they clearly exercised Garshenin. And Garshenin is a very important figure in my story, because already in the early 1940s, they're already talking about unfounded prosecutions and illegal arrests and so on. But in terms of his attitude to justice and criminal policy, he's not a liberal. And in fact, there's a paper, in fact, which you're going to be discussing in December, where I actually show that he's not a liberal. And in a way, we would like to think that they are liberals, that they're kind of sort of like us or whatever, or if we are liberals, don't make that assumption of everyone in this room, but they aren't. I mean, he isn't. Some of the speeches, some of the things that he says are very, very hard line, but he's very, very interested in protecting innocent individuals and in the importance of procedure.
Any questions? I've got another one. Oops, I've got another one. So you showed some data on political executions, and then on executions for crime. Now, could it be that they just changed the terms and in a kind of lawfare style of, oh, Navalny was really guilty of economic crimes, and violating his probation. It really wasn't his political activity. Is there any of that going on here?
No. I mean, this is something completely different. So, the people who are prosecuted for counter-revolutionary crimes, what happens, particularly with the mass operations, is that the centre it issues these quotas. So every region needs to arrest, 50,000 people. And so, the local NKVD heads think, well, how are they going to find these people? So they look at the registers, and they find kind of individual. They haven't committed any crimes, but they're sociologically dubious. The people who are convicted for theft, that they've all done something. They've stolen something, and it may be that they've stolen a few grains of wheat, or just some items from a factory, but they have done something. So it is fundamentally different, and in that regard, it's part of the regime kind of shifting gear, and moving towards, if you like, a kind of more positive orientation.
Yeah, there's also evidence from the Putin era that despite people's impression that the legal system is driven by the goal of arresting the high profile and the politically active, if you look at the actual arrest rates, it's really driven by very marginal people because they're just easier to arrest. They're less costly. It's just when you need to hit your quota, are you going to hit somebody with means, or are you going to hit somebody who it's going to be very easy to convict, very easy to roll over. So there's some echo of that. I mean, a flip way to think about your data, though, is to say, God, why were they so lenient on criminals in the 1930s? Why weren't they executing them back then?
Well, that's in fact also not entirely true, because the original resolution on theft, August 1932, is unbelievably draconian, and it introduces a death penalty for theft very often. And I mean, the number of executions is much more limited, but yeah, you couldn't say that was restrained in any way.
Yeah, hi. It was amazing to hear your talk. So I'm Renata. I'm a postdoc here in Russian politics. Russian politics, but I do a lot of society stuff. That is why I'm like super interested. And so I have a clarifying question about like your argument about secrecy and publicity, and also you mentioned an author that I just wanted to catch the name of. Could you say that again? So why is this important for your argument that Stalin was actually like fine with open courtrooms, like public proceedings? Just if you could clarify that, because I find this like in contemporary Russia that political trials are actually very public, and when you like, I did my grad studies in France, and researchers are like, oh my God, you could record your hearings with a recorder. This is crazy. So they find it mind blowing, because like if they go to Palais Justice, they cannot do the same. So it's like, oh my God, it's Putin's Russia. So it's like a self-interested question. Then I had a question. Like, well, I can imagine that this type of argument needs a lot of resistance. I don't know. I feel that every time when we try to make a more sophisticated argument that these kind of dictatorial authoritarian systems, that they have some kind of law, right? That it's not just like lawless, it's not just like total arbitrariness. And that, so I was wondering whether you encounter this type of resistance, whether you find it annoying or not. That's and I was wondering whether you need, whether you really want to preserve the concept of rule of law here, because I can imagine that in Russian it would be something like законность. And I'm wondering whether you really need the rule of law concept here to kind of, because it's important for, like, I don't know, because you're interested in political normative implications of this type of scholarship, or whether it's like you are more interested about like the, to kind of send a message about your empirical stuff, and that you could abandon, rule of law and just like, take a less kind of, because you're saying this at the beginning yourself, that it's a very kind of heavy concept, and that it comes with all kinds of, it just brings so much stuff in the imaginary of
of people across the world, and I can just like imagine, you know, the reviews that you will get. I mean, I can imagine that at your stage of the career, you can allow to yourself to do this kind of things. And I was also thinking about like Nick Chibman and his article on rule of law and law and order in Myanmar, and how like he just like didn't find it helpful to talk about rule of law anymore, and that it's actually like it was law and order, the kind of law that they had in Myanmar, and this is like another way of thinking about this type of legality, authoritarian legality.
Great, thanks. So really excellent questions, Renata. Thank you. Publicity. Why is it important? I'm interested in ideas, and if I'm talking about ideas, I need to identify exactly what they are. And then I'm looking at particular patterns in the discussion. What are the things that the jurists are particularly interested in emphasizing? And publicity is one of them. Now, publicity can take different forms. So you have the show trials, and the show trials are to do with eliminating the opposition, and they don't really work very well. And they're adapted, they're changed. So you get a kind of evolution from the show trials in 1936, 1937 towards the international tribunals. There's a lot of people kind of working on that issue. But this is different. This isn't. It's not to do with eliminating the opposition. It's to do with creating a new order. And you're using the court and the publicity that is given to the court as a mechanism for creating new norms. And you can only create those new norms if this is done. It's done in the open. Now the jurists can't write about extrajudicial tribunals because these are completely secret. But what they can do is to talk about publicity. And the implication is that they are very critical of these extrajudicial tribunals, and that comes to a head in 1953 when all the extrajudicial tribunals are liquidated. They're all eliminated. So in terms of, I'm just going to move on. So the second question was to do with dictatorship, dictatorial system, and whether that there will be. I expect there to be resistance to this kind of argument. And yes, there probably will be some sort of resistance. I think one of the reasons, I suppose, I'm going to bring this into the discussion of the rule of law and why I'm using that. It kind of deals with there's a sort of laziness around the use of that term. And so it's merged with, democracy, and it's very closely associated with our views of the West. What I'm trying to show is that it is possible for jurists in another system to have something that goes beyond simply legality. They're not just interested in complying with procedures, but there is a larger vision. There is a larger kind of mission, if you like, and that leads to something that is more complex than simply legality. The criticism that I anticipate, and I've given this paper a few times, sometimes people come up with is the idea that there was a book came out in 2008 from Ginsburg, and Mustafa on rule by law, and I think one of the reasons, I think that's a bad term, and I think it really doesn't work. And one of the advantages of rule of law is precisely because it deals with why I think that doesn't work. And that actually takes us back to how I was going to conclude the paper, and the actual Mobley and Robinson discussion of Gilgamesh and how we view the state and so on, which I'm happy to talk about. But I think that the rule of law it enables me to look at discussions even in the 1950s. And there was a really interesting debate between Lon Fuller and and H.L.A. Hart in 1958 in the Harvard Law Review, precisely about these issues. And in a sense, Lon Fuller was saying, "Oh no, we can't use law. When we're talking about this regime because we know that this is the exact opposite." And Hart is saying, "Well, actually, perhaps we can. Depends how we view these terms, how we define them." So, I mean, you are right. There will probably be criticism, but I'm kind of okay with that. I think.
Good. Can I have one question we have several questions from the audience here. One is, how were these understandings of Soviet authoritarian rule reflected in formal legal training in the Soviet Union? Were they at all or no? That's a good question.
That's a really, I think, a very important question. So in 1946, there is a very important Central Committee resolution on training legal cadres, and it completely transforms the threshold, the criteria that need to be met in order for someone to become a judge or a procurator. But it doesn't it doesn't inculcate a legal ethos. Or Richard Walkman wrote about legal consciousness and so on. You don't have that. It's actually much more mechanical, much more technical. And one of the things that Raz is interesting about when he writes about the difference between conformity to the rule of law and obeying rule of law, or obeying the law. And obeying the law involves knowledge of the law, and understanding the principles of the law. And we don't have that much evidence. Further you go down the system of that happening. I mean, they're trying to do that. They're trying to, and it becomes a priority, and the Central Committee, issues a resolution and so on. But again, we need to be quite realistic about what this regime is able to achieve.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not so much a question, but maybe a remark, because so I'm before the United Nations, but before a lot of time in Soviet Union. So, we need to remember that first, Lenin had his diploma in law in Kazan and after in St. Petersburg. So, and the method of Lenin, just even before the revolution, was mostly the criticism. So, was critical of philosophy, of economy, of history, and also law, less maybe. But so, what is happening that after that, the kind of it was necessary to continue, even in our education, also this method of criticism. But when you criticize law theories in the West, capitalist or imperialist, etc., incidentally, you study that. And this is what is happening. And I remember myself from the university during the Soviet Union. So we were, of course, studying the kind of a socialist approach to philosophy, etc. But we needed to criticize that the other one was wrong. But for this, you needed to read it.
Yeah.
So I think that this is what maybe our young students may not realize. But even the time of Lenin and Stalin, it was still necessary to criticize the others and criticize them with a lot of logic. But for this, you need to go very deeply, and this is why maybe then the perestroika started. So it was maybe strange for you here. How come all these lawyers appeared and they were so much progressive, they were so much, scientific, etc., etc. But because they were criticizing it all their life. And now they decided that what they were criticizing maybe is good for Soviet Union and the perestroika. So this is how it happened.
Great, thank you very much. I mean, it's a very an interesting idea. One of the people who drives this movement right across, actually, I mean, he was a very long-lived individual, Mikhail Solomonovich Stragovich, launched a campaign for the presumption of innocence, amazingly, in 1948, 1949. So he was regarded as somebody on, if you like, the statist or the moderate wing. But he was occasionally wheeled out in order to criticize capitalist law. So there are a number of, there's a famous article in La Gazzetta in 1952 that he wrote, and later on as well. But it's very clear from his criticisms that he's very familiar, and he's read about these laws. And he wouldn't be able to carry out these criticisms had he not been familiar. And then there's this terrible balancing act. On the one hand, you're borrowing some practices, but on the other hand, you need to show that you are superior. But I think that's absolutely right. Yes.
It's a question in the back.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Katharina Golazon. I'm a historian visiting from the University of Cologne, Germany. And I was also very interested in these jurists that have been talked about quite a lot now. And I'm a historian of knowledge, and I think what would have helped me a lot to understand your argument would be to learn more than about these contemporary ideas that were around that are traveling from very different places, but what are they? You were referring a lot to the 1936 Stalin Constitution, but as you said, these are transnational ideas that are around there. So for instance, what is the idea of the rule of law in the 1930s, right? In Moscow, and where does it come from? Or other very central ideas that are around that feed these jurists in their writings. And then I have the second, just a remark, and this comes probably because I'm German. Growing up in Germany makes you think about the rule of law and democracy from the latest stage, from the time you enter secondary school or something. And there, the idea that is very present in public debate today, because we also have a crisis of democracy in Germany right now, is that so we need democracy to establish a rule of law. But it's not so much the idea that they come automatically together, but rather that because we have the experience of Nazi Germany, where it was an experience of legality framing a dictatorial murderous regime, that now we need democracy that guards a rule of law that actually lives up to its name. Just to share that.
Right, yes, okay, thank you. Yeah, I think with regard to the first question, I think one of the things that it points to is a particular difficulty, which is that they don't have a term for the rule of law. They don't use that. So there isn't an umbrella concept that is equivalent to how the rule of law is used in the West. And that does present a particular problem. And that's the reason why I'm looking at individual ideas in the first instance. I'm trying to kind of look at the relationships between those ideas and to see how they're framing those relationships. The issue of kind of transnational borrowing is complicated because it's there, but they can't be explicit about it. And what they can't do is to say, oh, well, we've got this from current constitution in the United States or what have you. So some of these ideas are smuggled in. There is a moment in 1936 when Wyszynski says, if we borrow here and there from bourgeois law, that there's no shame in that. Which is kind of in a way a strange thing to say. And they do, there are moments when you get very kind of subtle references to what's going on in other countries, but they can't be too explicit about it. But the relationship between the ideas, I think, is important because I think there is a discourse, but they don't have a term for the rule of law, which is to a degree a problem for me. The German case is a very, very important one, of course, for all sorts of historical reasons. One of the things that I don't buy into is that the notion of a dual state for all sorts of reasons, which you get with Franco and so on. I also think I once wrote an article comparing Stalinism and sort of Nazi Germany, and my view is that these systems are moving in completely different directions, and by the mid 1930s. What you have in the Soviet Union is a kind of very clear sort of state building kind of project. And they're talking about extending rights to different groups and so on. And you have something very, very different going on in Germany. I think with regard to the relationship between the rule of law, rule of law and democracy, it's a complex one. I think particularly now when we're living in a period of crisis of democracy, and we see kind of democracy in effect, it's in a very, very difficult sort of state. So I think one of the interesting things there, if you look, a lot of the people who are writing in the 1980s and 1990s about the relationship between democracy and the rule of law, they go back to Hayek. But Hayek is actually very, very skeptical about democracy. He's very interested in the rule of law, but he's really not at all sure about democracy. And in some ways, to a degree, Hayek is kind of anticipating some of the things that have happened over the last 20 years, because he sees that democracy can easily go wrong. So there are all sorts of cross currents here, but there isn't, in my mind, there isn't a sort of a very simple kind of transfer from one to the other in the way that I think that was very often represented in the 1990s.
I think I have one more question. This is from our online guest, Sofia Kalashnikova Horowitz. I'm researching the social and institutional history of informing. Neat. I was wondering in my documents, the political police suggest that a large percentage of cases returned for further investigation to the political police from the organs of justice is an example of brak v работе. This idea comes up in the late 1940s, early 50s. The solution to this, per the MGB, is more careful framing of evidence through more careful informer work. I'm looking for reasons that the all-union informer/policing reforms of January 1952 took place, which were intended to improve informer work. Do you think that the phenomena you discussed from 1948 may have had a relationship to laying the groundwork for the 1952 political police reforms?
Okay, yes. So
that's why I wanted to ask the question.
That's a specific question. I think the two are absolutely connected. So it's it turns into brak v работе. Absolutely. And what is also very interesting is that there's a professionalization of the secret police in this period, and the bureaucracy begins to exert more control even before Stalin died. What happens to the secret police, to the MGB, and to the security police in 1952, 1953? That's a very, very complex question. Unfortunately, we don't know enough about it. There is a resolution actually in July 1951, and there's a campaign which is associated with Malenkov about reorganization of the secret police, but we know sadly very, very little about it. And when I ask my Russian colleagues, when I was able to ask them about it, they said that the information is sadly lacking.
Yeah. Well, great. Thank you very much. This has been a really terrific talk. We're so glad to have had Yoram here. So please join me in. Great stuff. It's great stuff. I'm just interested in the rule of law a lot more, and of course my research earlier, and I should go back to it because it's so. Actually, I am doing some stuff. We're doing kind of survey work in Ukraine on compliance with judicial decisions and willingness to sacrifice on behalf of the state.